Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here to talk about the 1988 film Child's Play. So, when going into this, we have a movie that really goes into voodoo, which I was like, okay, this is like a very interesting approach to this movie. We also have Chucky, who is at some points in time, like it seems like there's very vastly different dolls that are all doing different kinds of things at some point. So, like at some point, you just have like the doll that is just to be like a prop that eventually is to have like Andy sleep with it or just have it lay there or stay there or whatever. There's some probably dolls that can say stuff or eventually there is puppeteer or whatever like dolls that do a little bit more stuff here and there. So going into this, I realized that there is also a Mark Hamill remake, which I've also seen and at some point will hope to have reviewed on this channel if it already hasn't, because I already have a review set up on the other channel, so eventually it's going to come here if it hasn't already. So eventually we'll have that at some point here, so it will be here. Going on to this, at some points there are some odd approaches with here because there are some odd deaths. Reasonably, at some point it was kind of interesting to see this movie through the perspective of the killer, because sometimes we do get that through certain kind of things, like maybe like a Friday the 13th or something like that, where you get the villainish character running around and then you get to see the other person on the other end going, oh, what was that? Was that the Santa Anta winds rolling in? And but no, it was Chucky strolling around. Because ultimately uh, you have I think Maggie Peterson, who ultimately is Karen's coworker, that ultimately is very much sitting in the kitchen, and she is going to have to be prepared for something. So some odd like deaths in this movie, some odd like approaches, but I don't know. I guess when looking at this, you could probably look at this and like you could say like Jack Frost is kind of a similar movie to this, but it's instead of it being like a person being put into a doll, you have a person being put into a snowman, and then the snowman uh, at some points can turn into a liquid like substance to be put into a drain somewhere and then re cement himself like a Sandman-ish like person. Mood point, but Jack Frost is an interesting movie. The villain, the horror movie Jack Frost. So, Child's Play. We have in this movie, I would call this a very uncomfortable, like not a very, but this movie is an uncomfortable film. I guess it probably still holds up as a scary film if you've never seen it. Uh, there are some points about it that I do enjoy. Basically, the puppeteerish work, or just like realizing, like, okay, how many dolls did they have to make in this movie to do all this stuff that they needed to do? Like, did they have like 20 of them? Like that had to do certain kind of acts or certain kind of things, and eventually when the doll eventually gets burned at some point heavily, uh, eventually we have several variations of that at some point. So going into this, you have a small buildup of Chucky eventually really being a thing in this film. It kind of feels like this slow build of Jaws, where it's like you have the character mostly be a doll until eventually he has to start killing people, and even that you can kind of slowly but surely see um, Chucky come in there. And so I think the best part about this movie is when we eventually have that car scene with Mike Norris, who ultimately is playing the detective in this movie that I know him, Chris Sarandon, from being in the movie Fright Night. Fright Night, I love Fright Night. I love both the two original movies, and then I love the two remake films. If you've never seen Fright Night before, really enjoyable movie. So go and check them out if you haven't. So we have it all seemingly voodoo magicked in to have a spirit. I know within the Mark Hamill remake, they didn't go that route. It kind of was like a smart doll that eventually ended up getting too smart for its own good and ended up killing a lot of people in the process. It seems like there is always within these Chucky films a Chucky that has to kill somebody via being in the back seat, which I thought was weird. Um, I never quite understood that about these films, but I guess that's just a lynch mark or a thing that they have to focus on trying to always try to do within these films, because when having Brad Dourif, who ultimately is in the Urban Legend movie, where ultimately he shouts out the words like, "There's someone in the back seat." Basically, he's known for his Chucky character at some points being in the back seat of a car. So, Catherine Hicks, if I haven't mentioned it, she was in. She was mostly known for being in the Seventh Heaven series. She was also in the Star Trek. I think the one where they have the humpback whales and Scotty shouting out, "There'll be whales here!" And ultimately, like everybody's just like, "Yeah, humpbacks." I don't know why, but humpbacks. If only they'll remake that film for reasons I won't understand, but they might do it eventually if they run out of ideas. So, yeah, let's go into spoilers about this movie, because at the end of the day, there's only so much to say about it cryptically. So let's go into it biblically, because maybe at some point I will probably mess up this review because there might be some jumbled around parts within here that I might have to course correct at some point, but it may happen. So going on into here, we have Karen Barclay, who is a woman that ultimately is wanting to give her kid the perfect gift. Recently, she ends up giving him a gift, and recently he's just like, "Yeah, but I would really have wanted this buddy doll." And really, Karen is like, "Well, yeah, but I didn't really have the money for that." Eventually, Karen is working at some retail store that ultimately I was like, okay, hopefully there's not some kind of vibes going on with this movie. And eventually, she ends up having the doll that her son wants uh, via purchase through some hobo, because really some hobo had been able to vicariously drop his way into getting this doll, through means which I will explain now. So, in the very beginning of this film, we have Charles Lee Ray, that is the Strangler. And ultimately, Charlie ends up being found out about the police, these detectives. And detectives in like undercover like gear that are ultimately like stalking him and ultimately tracking him down. We ultimately have one detective that is seemingly on his case and running after him to the point of shooting Charles. So recently, Charles' last resort is to ultimately go into uh, this this store and ultimately go into touching upon this doll and saying this voodoo like incantation, which ultimately, when the detective arrives within the store, he's hearing uh, Charles chant this and he's like, "What is going on? What is this nonsense?" And so, reasonably, it ends up being that within this, both Charles and the detective that was after Charles had both died. But Mike Norris had been within this case. And so reasonably, excuse me, that is where we have it in here where we are going to retime Chucky onto to Mike Norris. So we ultimately have Karen, who is giving this doll to now her son, the one gift that Andy did want. So ultimately, she is going, I think, on her break because she's ending up having to stay late for work. And ultimately, we have her coworker, which I believe is Maggie, going and getting to be able to babysit for Andy. So for that night when Karen has to work late. So what ends up happening is that Andy ends up like being like totally enamored with this doll, ends up sleeping with it, ends up just like, oh my god, this is the greatest thing that I've ever had in my life as a doll. So recently, Chucky is being Andy's best friend, telling him that he loves him and that he like hugs him and everything like that. And but like Andy hugs Chucky, not the other way around. Uh, Chucky has like he just says some things, and then ultimately he's just like laying there like a log until eventually he will become active. So ultimately, Maggie is just sitting around in the home, just having a good time. And so reasonably, Andy is off supposedly going to bed. So what happens is that Chucky eventually gets up and just starts like rummaging around the house, just kind of doing some stuff here and there. Ultimately, you can kind of hear the pitter patter of little feet. Maggie is like, "Hey, is that you, Andy? Is that you? Peekaboo, is that you, Andy?" There is no answer. Ultimately, Chucky keeps rummaging around, knocking things over. I think knocking over a thing of sugar at some point in the kitchen. Ultimately, Maggie goes in to assess the noises that were going on. Eventually, goes into the kitchen. Chucky ends up going and getting a hammer. And reasonably, what happens next after this is that Chucky ends up taking the hammer into Maggie's eye and ends up having her crash through the kitchen window to fall out of the building to her death. So we have a bunch of detectives all lined up into the house, and there's either a bunch of just guys in their dress blues, or you have Mike Norris that is in his undercover suits or trench coats, whatever. So reasonably within this movie, you have it to where Mike Norris seems to notice a hammer that is lying on the ground in the kitchen. Ultimately, he gives the hammer to somebody put in a bag as evidence for quite possibly a murder weapon. And eventually, they are asking the kid questions, and Karen is coming home and all like, "What is going on? Oh my god!" And ultimately goes into her home with all these cops there, and she's ultimately getting to her son, ultimately asking if he's okay. He's completely okay, but uh, you have Dr. Ardmore that seems to be right away involved in seemingly this case of this kid honestly just being asleep, but it's like, well, maybe there's something about this kid. Maybe there's something about him. I think Jack Colvin, I think, was in the Incredible Hulk series. When usually you usually get David Banner that'll ultimately be thumbing it off to the side at every end of every episode, and you get that sad little piano music, but na 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 na, but na 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 na, or whatever, and like you'd see him just be thumbing it off the side of the road. Yeah, that guy. So we ultimately have Dr. Ardmore that's kind of like, you know what? Like, there's something about this kid. Maybe he's the killer. Maybe he killed these people. So, but eventually, like, they don't have anything to really tie this kid on to anything. So, recently, eventually, they have it to where we have Andy that is playing outside and he's playing with Chucky. You have a guy that is coming into his home, and ultimately he is very paranoid, and he is very much like holding onto a gun, and he's like, what's going on in my house? Andy is trying to look for Chucky. He can't quite find him. Chucky ends up going into this building that this guy with the gun is in, and ultimately he ends up pulling the gas cord to release gas in the house, and then Chucky gets out of the house. Of course, we have it to where seemingly this assailant with this gun ultimately walks into this house and just fires away and ultimately explodes the entire building. Eventually, we have it to where Andy is telling his mother that ultimately Chucky is telling him things, uh, telling him about people, saying some adult like phrases and stuff like that. And Karen is just like, why is my son saying all this? Like, seems like he's telling me the truth, but why would a doll be telling me all of this? So, reasonably, it ends up that it seems that Karen and Mike seem to like consistently start to become like intertwined with one another. It seems that Mike is consistently working on this case, and eventually Karen will get in touch with him at some points or another. But eventually, we get it to where Karen eventually has her son go and talk to the doctor because what he's saying doesn't really seem quite rational. And so the doctor is checking up on him. Karen ultimately won't let it go that she felt like her son was telling her the truth. So eventually we have Karen that has the box of the Chucky doll, and bizarrely it ends up that the batteries end up falling from the box, and she's like, oh crap, I never bought batteries for this doll. This doll should have never talked. Okay, there is something about this. So Karen ends up grabbing the doll and trying to make it talk, slapping it around, punching it, and like, talk to me, dang it, talk to me. So we have to where eventually she turns the doll over to see if there are batteries in the back of this doll. She ends up opening it, and surefire enough, there's no batteries in there, and ultimately the doll speaks, very much saying, I love you, or something like that. And so Karen drops the doll. Chucky starts going around the uh, seemingly the apartment. It gets to the point to where eventually Chucky uh, jumps onto Karen and bites her several times. Karen ends up kicking away the doll, or pushing away the doll, and the doll ends up running off, and eventually goes into the elevator, and Karen is running after it to try to prevent her from getting to try to prevent the doll from getting to possibly Andy or anyone else that is close to her. So eventually we have it to where Karen ends up going to Mike and mentioning that she found out that the doll had no batteries, that ultimately she shows him the bite marks uh, that she had gotten, and ultimately she's saying that the doll is really alive. Mike is like, there's no way that this is true. Where did you get this doll? Ultimately, Mike uh, tries to find out the original owner of this doll and asks some questions where he got it. Ultimately, this doll is tied to his case that he worked on with the original detective that was tied to Charles Lee Ray's case. So Charles Lee Ray. So we have it to where Mike is driving about, uh, trying to rationalize or justify this case because there's no way he's going to be able to tell this to anyone and they'll believe him. So he ends up just driving around, and what ends up happening is Chucky ends up taking seemingly the like battery wires and ends up like choking this detective. And so while this is going on, like, he's desperately trying to drive and he's having a hard problem because he's getting choked. We have to where the detective is breaking free from these wires, but then eventually Chucky goes and starts like repetitiously having a knife and stabbing through the seat. So reasonably, this guy is still trying to drive as best as he can, but Chucky is just knifing through the seat. Ultimately, eventually, Chucky gets to the point of controlling the gas and brake pedals, and eventually, the detective just like completely flips his car over, and so eventually, the detective gets his gun, and Chucky is consistently going around and around and around this car, trying to stab at the detective. At some point, just lunging out at him, and the detective ends up firing his gun and really sends the doll flying. So eventually, we have Chucky, who just ends up just kind of giving up, and the detective ends up having a sigh of relief. But now he believes Karen. So we have it to where Chucky goes and finds a person that you can't see visually on here. Okay. We have to where Charles eventually goes in to find this shaman of sorts, this voodoo guy that had given him this incantation originally to change into this doll. So we have it to where Chucky ends up going to this voodoo witch doctor, and he ends up asking him how exactly he can be able to change back into any human. And we have it to where this voodoo shaman is mentioning to him, it's like, well, like, I'm not going to tell you that. And so what Chucky knows is that this voodoo shaman, evidently every single time that he has a customer, evidently he showcases that he has a voodoo doll of himself. And so Chucky ends up finding said voodoo doll and ends up torturing said man by breaking his arms, breaking his legs, and then stabbing him in the heart to get this information. Eventually, the voodoo shaman mentions to Chucky that he needs to have the first person that befriended him. Chucky has to go into that person's vessel, and Chucky's like, dude, I'm gonna have to be 6 again? Like, I'm gonna have to relive my whole entire life all over again? Are you kidding me? And and ultimately the voodoo shaman is like, well, yeah, because if anything, the longer that you're in that doll body, the more you're going to become human. And so ultimately you need to find a real true human body before this becomes permanent. So we have it to where Chucky runs off after killing this man. Eventually Karen and Karen and Mike eventually go to find this environment, find this area that this voodoo shaman was in, and ultimately, like, they're there a little bit too late. Ultimately, he is just about to die, and ultimately, Karen is like, how do we stop him? How do we kill him? Like, how do we take this thing down? And ultimately, the voodoo shaman mentions that it's like you gotta shoot the heart, you gotta kill the heart, and that's how to take this thing down. So eventually, they leave, and reasonably, we find Chucky eventually making his way to the hospital that Andy is staying. Eventually, it seems that Andy is looking out the window and noticing Chucky arriving to this hospital off to the distance. Andy is scrambling to the door to speak to his doctor, Doctor Arclave or Ardmore. Or did I say Arclave? Ardmore, and mentioned him that, hey, like, I see Chucky, he's out the window, he's coming for me, he's gonna kill me. And Dr. Ardmore is like, okay, like, you're like we're really gonna have to, like, if anything, you're just kind of seeing things. If anything, like, maybe he's gonna need something to sleep or something like that. So eventually, we have it to where Chucky is easily and quickly making it through to this hospital, eventually making it to try to get to Andy. It seems like there is eventually to where Andy kind of outsmarts Chucky and kind of scrambles to get out of his room, and eventually lands him into another hospital like room. Chucky is repetitively trying to follow him and get to him, and also so is Dr. Ardmore. And eventually, Dr. Ardmore is going to give Andy a sedative because ultimately he's like, God, you were like, kid, I don't know how you got out of your room, but like, you're losing it. I'm gonna give you a sedative. It'll only sting for a little bit. Chucky is eventually stabbing the doctor in the leg, dropping him down. Eventually, Chucky ends up putting a electronical device on the doctor's head, and he turns it on, and he is consistently getting electrocuted to the point of blood coming out of his mouth. And we now have it to where Andy and Chucky are in, or like, it seems like Andy, like, desperately, like, there's no one he can turn to. Every single time he tries to turn to or tries to mention anything, he's the boy that cries wolf every single time. We eventually have it to where Chucky is seemingly flying out of everywhere to try to get to this kid, but it's not working. So we eventually have it to where Karen is making it to the hospital to get her son. And so in all actuality, like, Andy and Karen eventually go back home, and reasonably everything is seemingly copacetic, because reasonably there seems to have been a death at this hospital, and Mike is trying to convince the detectives that it's not Andy, it's someone else. And like, reasonably no one is really believing Mike, but he's like, but we need to do something about this. We need to take care of this kid. And so reasonably we have to where Karen, Andy, and Mike are all at the apartment again, and so reasonably, or no. We have Karen and Andy who are at home, because what happens is that Chucky re-arrives at this home, and eventually, uh, we have it here where ultimately Chucky arrives at the home. I think at some point he ends up stabbing the detective, Mike Norris, in the leg at some point. And recently we have Karen and Andy who are scrambling around the house. And I think that is what ends up happening. That's why the detective is completely incapacitated, because he ends up getting stabbed in the leg by Chucky. I don't know why there's so much stabbing going on with this person, with Chucky and knives, but otherwise he gets the detective gets taken down. But then eventually he is like in the house still, and eventually he is like trying to get his gun out to shoot Chucky at some point. Oh yeah. Because what ends up happening is he gives one of his guns, like he gives his ankle gun to Karen, and tells them to like go somewhere safe, while Mike is trying to recover from his ankle wound. So the detective, Karen, and Andy make it back to this apartment, and Chucky gets the jump on them. Let's just say. So again, the detective ends up getting stabbed in the leg, dropping him down. He gives gun to Karen, and Karen ends up running around the house, trying to close a bunch of intermittent doors, realizing that there are some doors open. Chucky is making his way to opposite doors as well, and like Karen is consistently, desperately trying to keep these doors shut because Chucky is opening them and almost coming in, and it's a desperate attempt back and forth to keep these doors open, to where eventually they have a mad scramble to where ultimately when Chucky's going to one door, they're going through the other to make it around back into the seemingly front of this apartment where there is a fireplace. So eventually Chucky gets to the fireplace, and what ends up happening, interestingly enough, is that we have Karen consistently being attacked by Chucky. I'm gonna pause here for a second. Reset. It's like whew, I was like I was so into it, but I was like, let's take a second to breathe here. Um, so yeah, we have Karen making it to the fireplace, and so now we have it within this movie to where here's where this doll is really gonna get disfigured. So Karen is trying to very much push Chucky into this fireplace. Eventually, she's putting this seemingly like fire or cage like shutter in front of this fireplace, holding it in there, and desperately she's like knocking a bunch of like candles from like on top of the fireplace to eventually like knock candles down or knock matches down. She can't really see because she's just trying to hold up Chucky. And recently you have it to where the one time that a mother will let a son do this, Karen can't reach the matches. So Karen asks Andy if she can get her the matches, and so reasonably he does. He lights the matches and tries to put the the match into the fireplace to burn Chucky. So now Chucky is burning bait, and like Karen puts a seemingly candle or some kind of log or something in front of this fireplace to hold seemingly Chucky within it, but eventually he breaks out, kind of starting to be burnt and in flames, kind of uh, walking quite a bit around the house and onto the couch, and eventually I think gets to the point of seemingly being being very much to the point of being quickly put out. So we get to the point of Mike is now seemingly back up, and reasonably it seems like the family is kind of like, okay, well, like he's still alive, he's still kicking, and like what are we gonna do now? So immediately we have it to where it seems that Mike Norris's partner eventually comes within the apartment and is assessing like, hey, what's going on? Because it seems like this doll absolutely will not die, even when they end up like uh, at some point when the doll is burst and or is crispy and they are trying to shoot it. They are trying to fire upon it within a room, and they are ultimately like the head of Chucky even comes off at some point when Mike's partner arrives. The doll is still adamantly going after anyone, trying to kill anyone. The doll is even headless and is still trying to kill seemingly Mike Norris's partner and does not succeed. And so rationally, again, they are trying to fire bullets upon this doll, and basically Karen has to mention like, you have to shoot it in the heart. That's the only way to kill it. So Mike is trying to fire onto this thing, and it's not going that well, but eventually he shoots it in the heart, and that seems to be the definitive way to kill this thing. And so now Mike looks to his partner. He's like, do you believe me now? And he's like, yeah, but who's going to believe me is the problem. So recently, Hassan, everybody, good, happy times and whichever. And so reasonably, there is no real rational, like, cementing conclusion to all this. And reasonably, it's just like, well, uh, eventually when there are sequels, they'll have to figure out how to rebring Chucky back to life, or probably put him in a new doll, or make new parts out of him, or something. But yeah, so reasonably, yeah, like the whole shooting the heart thing really kind of wrapped this movie up. But yeah, interesting voodoo-ish like parts. The whole voodoo thing, I was like, okay, that's a weird kind of like tossing in there when you get Charles chanting in the beginning of this, but they eventually clarified like what happened later on in the movie. But I thought it was like, well, like why couldn't there have been like an opening scene where we rationalize the voodoo part in the very beginning of this movie, and like it doesn't really seem like we knew much at all about Charles before he eventually becomes Chucky. It just seems like they call him the Strangler, and there isn't much to know about him. Besides some apartment where it seems like there is some very interesting paintings or there's a very interesting like motif of a room where there's like a bunch of paintings everywhere and this and that. So yeah, that's all that I have to say about Child's Play. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I enjoyed this movie. Like it was just like eventually I think I'll enjoy this movie when I get to see whatever the sequels bring. Eventually, when we get some maybe a movie that has a bigger budget or has a just a different approach, or otherwise maybe every single movie we have to do like figure out how this doll comes how a doll comes to life every single movie, which I think could be interesting. I don't really know if every person comes back every single time. Maybe they just shift or change things after a while, which will still be interesting. So at the end of the day, I think that's all I wanted to say about Child's Play. Uh, I just I thought that this was a fun, scary movie, and at the end of the day, that's all you could really say about this film. It was a first attempt and first swing, and maybe eventually they perfected this at some point. So I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.